Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, opening the door to private enterprise under the state's watchful eye, North Korea's bid to withstand international pressure. Also this week, Qatar launches a deep-water port in another step towards economic self-reliance. And targeting digital currencies, why China's banned fundraising through initial coin offerings. International sanctions against North Korea have been scaled up significantly over the past year, but Pyongyang showing no signs of slowing down its nuclear weapons program. Instead, it carried out its sixth nuclear test this month. Washington wants an oil embargo and a freeze on leader Kim Jong-un's assets, and it's threatening sanctions on any country that trades with North Korea. But analysts warn that North Korea has a well-established system in place to evade sanctions. In fact, its output grew at its fastest pace in 17 years in 2016. That's according to South Korea's central bank, which estimated that the economy grew by 3.9%, driven by mining and energy. North Korea doesn't publish economic data. China accounted for nearly 93% of all North Korean trade. Russia a distant second with just over 1%. Earlier this year, China said it'll stop buying North Korean coal, but it's not clear how effective the ban is. The UN says that weak enforcement allows North Korea to earn billions in foreign currency by selling drugs, weapons, banned minerals and counterfeit goods with the help of front companies and foreign nationals. And Pyongyang may be able to withstand some additional pressure because of the limited market reforms allowed by Kim Jong-un. They've opened the door to private business, the vast majority technically illegal but tacitly accepted. Some economists say wages and the standard of living of many citizens have improved. Joining us now from Seoul, Byung-Yeon Kim, a professor of economics at Seoul National University, recently published a book on North Korea's economy called Unveiling the North Korean Economy. Professor, good to have you with us. Current sanctions are clearly having no impact on North Korea's ambitions as far as its nuclear program are concerned. What more can be done in terms of sanctions? Are they going to have any effect?
I think that, there are three more sanctions possible. The first one is cutting off the oil supplies to North Korea. North Korea does not produce any oil, and so cutting off any oils to North Korea will hurt North Korea to a large extent. How effective it will be, it depends upon how much they have stored to prepare this kind of a sanction. China and Russia are main exporters of oil, mainly China. North Korea imports about 1 million tons every year, and half of this oil supply is done by China through pipeline. So if Chinese government cuts off this oil supply through pipeline, it reduces about 40–50% of oil consumption in North Korea. It will hurt the economy to a large extent.
Do you think that China...
The second one is...
sorry, Professor, just briefly, do you think that China would be willing to do that?
Well, it's a big question because cutting off oil means to abandon North Korea as an ally. And so it's a big decision. So I think China is reluctant to cutting off the oil supply totally. However, they may have to consider which is better between United States pressure or cutting off the oil supply. So I think this is big question and big determination. But as you know, the Party Congress will be held next month in October. So the decision may be made after the Party Congress rather than before, because it's a very big decision.
What about secondary sanctions on companies, on countries, individuals who are doing business with North Korea? Could they be effectively policed?
Right.
Would they be any use?
Well, the act was enacted in the United States, but we have to identify the individuals, institutions, and companies that do business with North Korea, and they have to be listed up. Therefore, it requires resources to monitor what kind of firms, what kind of institutions, what kind of companies do businesses with North Korea, what are the main items of the export-import. Therefore, it needs time and resources to monitor and list up the names of the individuals, companies, and institutions.
North Korea's economy, Professor, grew by, what, 3.9% last year. What's behind that growth? What's driving that growth, despite the fact that North Korea is a pariah state and there are all these sanctions in place?
That's right. But as you know, sanctions started some years ago. But basically, the real sanction effective one started this year, from March this year. Therefore, the growth record last year doesn't matter so much with the sanctions. The biggest driving forces are markets and trade. And this changes the economy of North Korea. And this market trade have put impacts on construction because the money coming from foreign trade helps to build large buildings in North Korea. Also, energy sector, because North Korea has built some power plants. Also, there was increase in agricultural production last year. These are mostly affected by trade, foreign trade, and marketization of North Korea.
When you talk about marketization, what do you mean exactly? And is that going to help North Korea withstand the impact of any further sanctions that are placed upon it?
Well, it is a very interesting question because, well, I think it's the markets like double-edged sword. Because of markets, North Korea economy function okay. But the markets basically undermine control of society because people engage in market activities. They do not rely on state rationing. Therefore, they become more autonomous. Therefore, it's in the long run, North Korean authorities may lose control over the people. So, one sense, yes, because the markets, economy is okay. Therefore, they can concentrate on nuclear weapon development and missile development. But on the other hand, in the long run, a market will undermine the control of society. And so, therefore, Kim Jong-un may have a dilemma between these two. As regards the extent of marketization, basically, is about 70 to 90% of household income come from markets. Therefore, although it's officially a social economy, is in fact is a marketized economy. It's not institutionalized markets, but basically market activities are very prevalent in North Korea nowadays.
Professor, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Okay, thank you.
Now, India's government is launching an ambitious project to connect major rivers across the country. It says that the plan is especially important after severe flooding from monsoon rains this season. But as Divya Gopalan reports now from Bihar, many fear that it could lead to an environmental disaster.
Bihar has been submerged by some of the worst flooding to hit the state this century. Hundreds were killed and hundreds of thousands made homeless in the past few weeks.
Nobody has come to help us. We were stuck with water all around. Nobody cares about us.
Bihar is flood prone. Almost every other year, thousands of homes are washed away and millions of lives disrupted. But the government says it has a solution.
If we are able to implement these projects, we will be greatly solving the problems of flood and drought in our country.
The plan is to connect 60 major rivers, including the Ganges. Those with surplus water will be dammed and diverted to rivers with lower levels. The government also plans to build 30,000 reservoirs and canals stretching 15,000 kilometers to control the flow. Some experts say this will improve transport and trade routes along the waterways, as well as boost the economy. But it comes at a price.
It has huge environmental impacts. It has a huge social impacts. It's socially very disruptive project. It will destroy the rivers.
In fact, it's estimated that millions of people will be affected. This community of farmers was uprooted 2 years ago to make way for a government infrastructure project, a bridge across the Ganges River. They're still waiting to be resettled and compensated, with fear that they will have to move again when the River Link project reaches Bihar.
I would advise people not to leave their place on government promises unless you get a proper legal document. The government cheats you.
Government leaders are being asked why the river linking plan is going ahead with so much opposition.
We have to see how to minimize the submergence and how to best address the issue of resettlement and rehabilitation.
But critics say these issues should be addressed before they ask taxpayers to foot the $87 billion bill this project will cost.
Qatar's emir has inaugurated the new deepwater Hamad port as part of a wider plan to ensure economic security. It means larger container ships can now go directly to Qatar rather than docking in the United Arab Emirates, where cargo was transferred to smaller vessels. The UAE is one of the countries that have imposed a land, air and sea blockade on Qatar. The port will have an annual capacity of 7.5 million shipping containers and separate terminals dedicated to general cargo, cereal, vehicles and livestock. It's expected to be fully operational by 2020. Joining us now from London, Andreas Krieg. Andreas is a strategic risk analyst focusing on the Middle East, security and assistant professor at King's College in London. Always great to have you with us, Andreas. What impact is the opening of this new port going to have on Qatar's economy?
I think it's a very significant development, irrespective of the crisis. I mean, Qatar was very much dependent on neighboring countries, especially the land border to Saudi Arabia, to get imports and exports out of the country, particularly imports. Although LNG has never been a problem. I mean, Qatar controls the entire supply chain of LNG from getting it out of the ground to actually to the terminals overseas. Anything else that has to be imported or exported from Qatar had to go via Doha port, which was a very small, way too small port in Qatar, which with a maximum capacity of 500,000 to 750,000 containers a year. And now you just mentioned 7.5 million is a significant increase in that. So it provides Qatar with independence. It provides Qatar with the ability to actually store food and to store consumer goods at a level that was never possible before, which makes, again, Qatar more sustainable and more resilient in times of crisis such as these. Apart from that, the Hamad port is part of a much wider project to create small and medium-sized enterprises around that area that will be able to have direct access to Hamad port and then again making the logistical cost for these companies to import and export easier. So I think it will have a massive impact also on Qatar's economy for small and medium sized enterprises, because obviously Qatar is trying to diversify, get away from purely relying on hydrocarbons, particularly gas, and then creating a more resilient economy that is based on the private sector. And I think this, for the private sector, this is a huge boost to have access to their own port, which is now 10 times bigger than the current port in Doha in terms of capacity, in terms of the ships that can dock there, in terms of the infrastructure that is needed. You know, this is a 21st century port that a country such as Qatar, with the ambitions that Qatar has, needs.
OK, what other measures could the country take to ensure long-term economic sustainability? You said that that the opening of Hamad is going to help as far as the ongoing blockade is concerned. What about the long-term future? What else needs to be done?
In terms of diversification, Qatar is at a very early stage. The reason is that Qatar, unlike other Gulf countries, is a lot more resilient in terms of its economic setup. The rentier state in Qatar still functions well because LNG can be still produced at very low cost, and the country is relatively small with a small population, so the diversification effort that is pushed now by the government is something that is a precautionary measure looking towards the future. Other countries are actually with the back against the wall. Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, for example, they need to diversify because they are already in the post-hydrocarbon era. Qatar isn't. But nonetheless, in terms of diversification, it is very important that Qatar is pushing the agenda just to be prepared for the future and have a private sector that is fully operational. And I think, and this is where Hamad Port comes in, it is important to be independent, to have independent trade routes with other countries and not be reliant as they were, they were over-reliant on Jebel Ali, which is the biggest port in the Middle East and close to Dubai. And now being independent of that, and if transshipment is needed, so basically when goods have to be transferred from bigger to smaller vessels, they can now rely on ports in Oman when necessary, but many ships can now directly dock at Hamad Port. That is very significant. The longer this crisis goes on, the more Qatar will develop new trade routes, which will be cheaper. And in many ways, this crisis has been a blessing in disguise, because Hamad Port couldn't have been used to its fullest capacity as it is being used at the moment, because of existing contracts with Jebel Ali and other ports in the UAE. Now, the UAE have decided to cut these contracts, to nullify these contracts, and now importers in Qatar can now look for more lucrative and maybe cheaper routes directly into Qatar. And the government is doing everything to incentivize this. There is a lot of incentives for local businessmen to create new imports, new avenues of imports, and using Hamad Port to do that. And they can do this in the long run more cheaper, or a lot cheaper than using, for example, Jebel Ali in the UAE. So I think long term, the economic cost of this crisis will go down significantly to a level that it is almost not worth mentioning anymore.
Andreas, great to talk to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, why 2 top French fashion houses are barring underweight models from the catwalk. But first, British workers at 2 McDonald's restaurants have been staging the first strike to hit the company in the UK. They're demanding better pay, union recognition, and the scrapping of so-called zero-hour contracts. Lawrence Lee reports from London.
And we will do everything we can to help you win this strike.
Going on strike when you don't know if you'll get any work next week is dangerous, and those who did it admit to being a bit scared. They made their point outside Parliament as well. When you get paid so little you can't even afford your rent, like Steve, who was living on people's sofas for the last 4 weeks, there isn't much to lose.
I've just got into a place now. I've been sofa surfing for about 4 weeks, and I've just got into a proper place now. At the moment, I'm just like sleeping on the floor while I save up for a bed. If it wasn't for the fact that they gave me free dinner, I don't know how I'd eat, because 5 days a week I get to eat at McDonald's. The McDonald's strike in the UK, the first in the company's history here, is being portrayed by the union movement as highly symbolic. Underpaid, non-unionised, zero-hours contract workers have been effectively voiceless. Now they're taking on a global giant. Of course, McDonald's might be emblematic of American working practices coming to Europe, but the fast food chain is by no means alone. In the UK now, almost 1 million people working in industries like food and retail are on zero-hours contracts with no apparent job security. It isn't just in the UK either. The workers here are being advised by more experienced unions from other countries.
The meeting I had with the workers from each of the stores which will be striking, it was like it could be any store in New Zealand 10 years ago before we started our organising drive.
You are an absolute inspiration.
The opposition Labour Party has raised the abolition of zero-hours contracts as a campaign tactic designed to appeal to vast numbers of voters.
I think across the world now, McDonald's is being confronted by people saying we've had enough. You make enormous profits, you need to pay a decent wage, recognise trade unions, end the exploitation of zero hours.
McDonald's says it has raised pay levels and is offering more secure employment. The workers want £10 or $13 an hour. Last year, McDonald's announced its shareholders received $14 billion.
2 of Africa's leading economies say that they've emerged from recession. The latest figures from South Africa and Nigeria show economic growth in the second quarter. Nigeria's output rose marginally by 0.55%, but that's after 5 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Returns from oil have risen, and that's crucial for a country that counts on crude for 90% of export earnings. And South Africa recorded 2.5% growth in the second quarter, a boost after 2 consecutive quarters of contraction. The main driver was agriculture. Output grew by 33.6%, but growth remains sluggish, and 1 in 4 South Africans is out of work. Now, you're likely to be familiar with initial public offerings, or IPOs, but have you heard of initial coin offerings? ICOs are increasingly seen globally as a quick way to raise large sums with little or no regulatory oversight. But a major market, China, has now banned the practice. Investors in ICOs buy digital coins of the company, which can appreciate in value if the business succeeds. But they don't get any share in the company, and there's no security, unlike the traditional public offerings. Once the tokens are issued, they can be traded against other cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin. These coin offerings have fueled a rapid rise in the values of cryptocurrencies this year. Chinese state media reported in July that there had been 65 ICOs so far, raising more than $394 million. Joining us now from Cambridge, Dr. Garrick Heilman. Garrick's a research fellow at Cambridge University's Centre for Alternative Finance. Good to have you with us, Dr. Heilman. What do you make of China's move here? What about the timing of it?
Well, the ICO market has been on fire of late. Well over $1 billion has been raised through ICOs just in the past couple months alone. That's almost equal to the amount of venture capital that the blockchain sector has attracted in 5 years. And so it's not surprising to see regulators in particularly hot markets like China raising concerns and looking to kind of slow things down a bit.
So is China's move going to slow down the growth of ICOs?
I think it will slow down the growth some. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission also recently issued some guidance, and I think other regulators here in the UK are also looking at ICOs. And this is going to cause people to take some pause and do a little more diligence on whether their ICO meets the definition of a security and which markets they may want to register. And some exchanges are already delisting certain ICOs from trading, and that's going to have an impact on liquidity and growth.
Is some sort of regulation actually needed? I mean, at the moment it seems to be a bit of a free-for-all with very little security for the investor.
Right. Well, I think there's certainly going to be some problems, and we've seen some thefts and some fraud already in the ICO space. I think that's a given. In the case of China, they have a history of very hot alternative finance activity, and there's been problems in the past. In the peer-to-peer lending sector, there was significant fraud as well. And so, the action by the Chinese is not surprising. Small investors, small players have been hurt in the past, and it's quite reasonable for regulators to be concerned about what's happening, I think, in this space.
Do you think that regulators actually fully understand ICOs?
I think, people are getting up to speed here, but I think there's still a lot of, education that needs to take place. Blockchain is a very complex subject. Recent data show that 80% of the people who've heard of it don't understand how it works. And so I think there is an education opportunity here. But regulators are moving quickly, I think, to learn what they need to know about the space.
And one final question, Garrick. How is China's move likely to impact upon the established cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, for example? Does it have the power to move the price?
Well, it did initially, but I think as people took a step back and didn't panic about what had happened, they realized this is one while significant market that's kind of slowed things down in the ICO space. It's not necessarily going to derail Bitcoin or other major platforms. I think regulation can also have some positive effects for cryptocurrencies and digital assets. They, suggest that they're going to be around for a while, and as these instruments become more regulated, it's more likely they'll be opened up on more traditional exchange, and institutional investors will have more access to them.
Dr. Heilman, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you for having me.
Europe's Human Rights Court has barred companies from snooping on their employees' emails without informing them in advance. The case centred on a Romanian man who'd created a Yahoo Messenger account to communicate with clients, but also used the account to chat with his family, leading to his firing. The court ruled that the man's privacy rights had been violated since his employer didn't let him know in advance that he was being monitored. Two giants of the French fashion industry are joining hands to ban models who are too skinny or too young. LVMH and Kering will adopt a charter to treat models better and say they'll persuade others to follow suit. Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
For some time now, the fashion industry has been criticised by people who say that it uses models that are too young or too thin, and that promotes unattainable, unrealistic ideals of beauty, and it can also encourage eating disorders such as anorexia. Now, two French fashion giants, LVMH and Kering, say they are going to change that. Now, that's important because they own many of the world's most recognized fashion brands such as Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, Gucci and Louis Vuitton. They have put out a charter, and that charter includes a ban on ultra skinny models and also stops the use of models under the age of 16 to represent adults on runways, catwalk shoots and advertising. Well, many people will be watching to see if this really sparks a change in the fashion industry. LVMH and Kering say that the new rules will be in place in this season's fashion weeks, which begin in New York on Thursday, and that they'll have a monitoring committee in place to make sure that the rules are enforced for their brands.
Natasha Butler in Paris ending our show for this week. If there's anything you want to comment on, then please do get in touch with us. Follow and tweet me at @afinnegan on Twitter using the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That link takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.